Hi there. It's your friendly servant of the Word at your service with this week's online study. This session will consider the Gospel reading for All Saints Sunday. For several weeks now, Jesus has been engaged in a back and forth conversation with many of the religious leaders of his day. Those days are now behind us. Last week's reading ended by telling us that from that day, no one asked him any more questions. But that doesn't mean that Jesus has nothing more to say about them, as you'll now see and hear. So, let me serve you this week's portion. Matthew 23, verses 1 through 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your Father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." Let's take a quick look at a few items in the early part of this passage. And for this, it will help if you have your Bibles opened. Notice I said Bibles. I continue to expect that there's at least two of you engaged in this study so that when I ask a question, you'll have somebody to talk to. Verse 2 refers to the scribes and the Pharisees. They are the keepers of the law. When you hear the word law, the Hebrew word is Torah. First of all, think of the Ten Commandments. Second of all, think of all 613 commandments that you can find in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Think finally of a huge body of oral tradition which tried to apply all of the above, the 10 commandments, as a part of the 613 commandments, to all of the situations that were not specifically addressed in those 613 commandments. That made for quite a heavy load of law. Verse 5 refers to broad phylacteries and long fringes. A phylactery was a little leather pouch in which a tiny bit of Bible verse was written and kept. These were tied on head and hand to literally practice the commandment found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." You may also have seen one of these on the doorframe of a Jewish friend or neighbor. They are called mezuzahs, and they also contain a little paper on which some Bible verse has been written, a way of keeping the last part of that commandment. Now, I think Jesus would say there is absolutely nothing wrong with keeping this commandment literally, so long as your heart is connected to the action. But simply doing the thing and thinking that doing the thing is all that God is interested, well, at that point, I'm not so sure you're on the right track. In this way, those with whom Jesus was in conflict seem to keep thinking that their side of the covenant is like climbing a ladder. Each commandment is like a rung on the ladder, and up you go. Keep all the commandments, you made it to the top. But don't forget, there are at least 613 of them. Yikes. Let's cut that back to just the famous 10 of the 10 commandments. Imagine a ladder with just 10 rungs, and you can arrange the 10 commandments on the rungs in any order you like. How far up the ladder can you make it? Well, speaking of the commandments, it is time for our first conversation question. In a moment, I'll invite you to pause the video on a list of the 10 commandments. Take a few minutes to talk together about which of the 10 you find is the hardest one to keep. As always, I'll be here when you get back. Rather than think about the commandments as rungs on a ladder, think of them instead as protective railings, the kind you'd find at places like Niagara Falls, or the Empire State Building, or one of my favorites, lining the pathway through the boiling sulfur pits at Lassen Volcanic National Park's Bumpus Hell. Think of the commandments as given to help keep you on the right path, to guide you in the right direction. Sure, if you climb over the railing, there's going to be consequences, but they were given not to stop you from doing things, but to guide you in doing things the way they should be done. Here is another way to think about how we continue in the covenant God made with us. God made a covenant with us and not a contract. Contracts always have escape clauses, but God will not abandon the relationship that has been established with the world and with us. We may behave like there's an escape clause in our relationship with God, but God cannot do that and cannot consider abandoning the relationship. And so we say thanks for this steadfast love by remembering two words: reverence and respect. Think of reverence as describing your relationship with God, the vertical dimension of your life. The first 3 of the 10 commandments guide us to show reverence in our relationship with God. In other words, in these commandments, God says, revere me above all other things, the first, revere my name, the second, and revere my day, the third commandment. Now, connected to this is the word respect. And the word respect describes some of the ways that you are called to relate to others, starting with those closest to you, the ones who gave you life. These remaining 7 commandments guide us to show respect to the people in our lives that we encounter on the horizontal plane, you might say. In other words, respect your parents. That's the 4th commandment. Respect the property of others and don't steal it. That's the 5th. Respect sexual boundaries. That's the 6th. Respect life. Don't murder, don't hurt. That's the 7th. Respect reputations. That's the 8th. And respect your neighbor every way you can. That's the 9th and 10th. And how interesting is it that you can place respect into reverence exactly 7 times? No more, no less. A quick word about verses 8, 9, and 10. I see these as something of an aside to the disciples, specifically aimed at them, to remind them that they are, at best, Jesus' assistants. The words in our translation, rabbi, father, and instructor, seem to be terms that in translation were used as signs of respect for the teachers of Jesus' time. But lest we all forget the source of all truth and wisdom, Jesus says, I will not have you using these terms, so people do not get confused about who their teacher is and their instructor is. It's me, says Jesus. And who their father is. It's God. Now back to reverence and respect as two words that summarize how we continue in the covenant God made with us. Think about people you've known whose lives have been examples of this kind of living. And I'm going to ask you to consider such people in just a couple minutes. I think you would agree that the more that a person demonstrates reverence for God and the things of God, and the more they show respect to others, the less time they spend thinking and worrying about themselves. Which brings us to verse 11, which is when Jesus turns back to addressing everybody, the disciples and the crowd together, when he says, "The greatest among you will be your servant." I don't know which of the 10 you chose as the hardest of the commandments to keep. One of them I believe is the hardest is the 8th, which is, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." In its simplest terms, it simply means you should not lie. Here's the way Martin Luther begins to explain this commandment in his small catechism. He says, "We are to fear and love God, so that we do not tell lies about our neighbors, betray or slander them, or destroy their reputations." That's the beginning of keeping this commandment. But as he does throughout his explanations of the commandment, there is a "here's what you should do" side that follows the "here's what you should not do." And on the positive side, he goes on to say, instead, we are to come to their defense, speak well of them, and interpret everything they do in the best possible light. That's the hard part of keeping this commandment, if you ask me. When someone says or does something that is really mean or insensitive or inappropriate, how easy is it to say to yourself, or worse, say to someone else, "Oh, what a jerk." But if you stop to realize that there is always at least one thing about that other person, their life, their circumstances, that if you knew it, would put everything about them in a completely different light and give you a totally new perspective on them, well, then you might not be so quick with your judgment. And to be able to put the best construction on someone's actions, that is a real service to them. And those who serve others are called the great ones by Jesus. He doesn't happen to use the word saint here, but if a saint is someone who lets the light of Christ shine through their thoughts, words, and deeds, then it's really the same thing, isn't it? So it's time for another conversation question. Think about people you know who are servants in the way Jesus describes. Pause the video a while and share some stories with each other about these saints that you have known personally or you have seen in action in the world. This coming Sunday, November 2nd, is All Saints Sunday. The word saint is derived from the word holy. If something is holy, it has been set aside by God for special use. You and I have been set aside by God for special use. We are to let our light shine, to be people through whom the light of Christ shines in the world. This is a very inclusive understanding of the word saint. To be a saint in this way does not require a person to be taken through a lot of steps in order to be officially recognized as one. What about you? Might your name someday appear in a book such as ours and be looked upon by others as they give thanks for the way you let the light of Christ shine through you? As they give thanks for the way you showed reverence to God and the things of God and showed respect for others in a servant way? Stranger things have happened. So as we prepare for worship this coming Sunday, All Saints Sunday, take some time to consider the you that you will bring to worship that day. I'm reminded of a story told of Abraham Lincoln, who made a habit of listening to a certain preacher. On one occasion, he was walking home from the church with an aide who asked him what he thought of the sermon. The president thoughtfully replied, "The content was excellent. He delivered with elegance. He obviously put work into the message." The aide said, "Then you thought it was an excellent sermon?" "No," Lincoln answered. But the aide said, "You said the content was excellent, it was delivered with eloquence, and showed how hard he had worked on it." "That's true," Lincoln said. "But the preacher forgot the most important element. He forgot to ask us to do something great." Well, in this passage, among many others, Jesus is asking you to do something great. So I invite you to pause the video and consider the worship preparation question that follows. We'll close this session with a short visit to Conejo Mountain Cemetery as we remember and give thanks for some of the saints of Mount Cross who now from their labors rest.